Hello and welcome to your first set of notes, this one being on historical thinking skills. And the skills, not necessarily the knowledge that you need and that we as teachers want you to take away from this course. So we'll go ahead and get started. So it's good to discuss what is history, thinking of the history courses that you've taken in the past and how this one might be even similar or a little different. It certainly is not what your textbook tells you, right? It's not just a list of information in your textbook, and it's also not just a list of dates or even only what your teacher tells you, right? It's not any one of these things, and it doesn't mean that any of these things are completely accurate. History is, however, someone's story. It's a compilation of a lot of people's stories of the past, based on each of those people's interpretation of the evidence and what happened, right? So it's not an absolute truth of what happened, it's someone's interpretation. And just a recall here of what it is not, it's certainly not set in stone, right? It's not absolute truth. And it's not just a class where we only memorize facts and dates, and it's also it's not a class where there's only one right answer. A lot of people have that misconception of history in that there's absolutely one answer, which in tests and things like that, of course there is, but when it comes to the skills of history and looking at things and looking at evidence, there's no one right answer. So what does a historian do? Well, let me ask you this. When you're told a fact or a new piece of information, do you take it as, okay, that must be fact, that must be absolute truth? Well, here's the thing. Our goal as your teachers is not that you just take it all in as absolute truth and say, okay, yeah, let's go with it. You said it was true, therefore it must be true. We do not want that for you. Instead, we want you to ask these types of questions like a historian would do when they answer historical questions. So when they're looking at historical questions, they're going to ask, what do all of the sources of evidence say? I don't want to look at just one. I don't want to read just one news article. I want to look at multiple resources. Which source is the most reliable? Why or why not? So understanding what makes a source reliable and being able to decipher what's good and what's not. And finally, what other sources should I examine to make a more informed decision? Should I only look from one news outlet in the morning when I'm looking at, what's going on in the world today? Or should I look at multiple? Okay, so one major step that historians are going to take, and that we want you to have the skill of too, and this might be a refresher for you, is to know the types of sources. This, again, should be a refresher. A primary source, think of it as a first, primary being first, right? It's a first-hand account of what happened. So it's a document or physical object, which could include a painting, which was written or created during the time in which you are looking at. Some examples would include diaries, speeches, letters, interviews. Okay, so any of those kinds of documents, but it could be a whole slew of things if it's created during that time that you're studying. A secondary source would be one that comes second, right? It comes after the time in which you're studying. It's a source that interprets or analyzes those primary sources. It's an interpretation of what happened. Some examples would be textbooks, articles, or documentaries. So let's talk about these historical thinking skills, and we're actually going to go over 3 of them. The first one is sourcing, and this is when a historian reads and analyzes where a piece of evidence comes from in order to figure out whether it is reliable. So they're analyzing things like who wrote it, when it was written, what perspective or bias, which we'll talk about those things, but they're analyzing it to see, okay, what might this tell me and how reliable is it going to be? So when sourcing a document, when looking at the sourcing skill, a historian must consider the document's perspective, meaning someone's point of view. So the author's point of view and kind of not necessarily what their agenda is, but what's the reason they're writing it and what place are they coming from during that time. And then bias. So this just being a preference toward one perspective. So this might be a little bit tricky for some of you in that what is the difference between bias and stereotypes? And you've probably had more experience with stereotypes. In that stereotypes are kind of a preconceived notion or idea, assumption about a group of people. And a lot of times that's a rather negative connotation towards that group of people, whereas a bias is a preference towards one perspective, a preference towards one side of an issue, and then that kind of guides their decision making when it comes to looking at sources and what's reliable even. So how do I know if a source is reliable? Well, you have to consider the perspective and bias of the author. So consider these examples. So if we look at this question over here, what do you think of Oak Hills High School's football team would be the question, okay? Well, source 1 is an Oak Hills High School student. Source 2 is an Elder student. Thinking of their perspective and bias, is one going to be better than the other? Probably, but both of these cases, an Oak Hills or an Elder student, are going to have a bias towards Oak Hills High School football. Consider the other question, would Hillary Clinton have been a good president? Well, consider source 1, Donald Trump's campaign manager or lead secretary, something like that, versus source 2, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton's husband and a previous president. Although both of these are going to have major bias, right? Bill Clinton might be the better perspective because he was a previous president, so he can kind of use his experiences to make that judgment call. And he probably knows his wife, right? So the next one, how do I know if a source is reliable? If the source utilizes stereotypes. So which piece of evidence would be more reliable in the examples below and why? Something to think about and even write in the margins of your notes. Hillary is not fit to be president because she's blonde. All blondes are dumb. Hopefully you notice right away that that is a stereotype, right? That's not just a bias. That's a negative assumption about a group of people based on something that categorizes them together, blondes. Source 2, Donald Trump is not fit to be president because he's not held any positions in the United States government. Little more reliable, right? Because that's true, and that might lead him to not be as great, right? But it's not using a stereotype as well, okay? It's talking about his experiences, not something that qualifies him into a group of people like blonde or male or female. So this is where you're going to flip to the chart on the back of your notes, and I want you to, we're going to consider 3 more ways of knowing if a source is reliable. Consistency of the source. Do the facts work together in one source, or do they contradict each other? And then one common way to check if information in a source is reliable is to corroborate with other sources. And that's a separate historical thinking skill that we're going to look at shortly. Author's qualifications, and in your notes we ask this question of who are you going to ask for advice on your jump shot or your free throw shot? Are you going to ask a basketball player or a basketball coach or a science teacher, right? That doesn't play basketball. I mean, one has credentials in basketball and the other does not, so that one's pretty self-explanatory. And then the last one being agrees with other credible sources. So are other credible sources cited, or are they just going off on a rant, right? They need to be using other credible sources. And is there consistency between sources? Historical thinking skill number 2 is the one we just mentioned a bit ago, corroboration. This would be to confirm if something is true, right? If a statement or a claim is true by comparing multiple sources of information or evidence. And that you don't just take one article or one piece of evidence and say, this is the truth. No, you need to look for lots of different sources. So how do you corroborate? You take multiple pieces of evidence, you compare them. You compare them in their reliability, you identify those similarities and differences, think of the old Venn diagram, right? You hypothesize and guess why the differences exist and make your own conclusion about what happened. And you always, always, always support your conclusions with evidence from those sources. So this would actually be historical thinking skill number 3, contextualization. So think of context. Context being what's going on around you. So when it comes to a source in history, you're imagining the setting of an event or time period. So when we put historical figures, events, and documents into context, what's going on at the time that it was created, we're able to better understand why they are saying what they're saying, why they're acting the way they're acting, and why they're making the choices they are making. Because we understand what's going on around them, we understand those motivators. Think of context in everyday life. It's influencing your behavior. So depending on the context or the setting you find yourself, we look, speak, and act differently. So for example, you act one way in class, and that's different from how you act when you're hanging out with your friends. And of course it should be, but that's because of context. You're not in school with your friends, meaning with the goal of having fun with your friends, right? And so it looks a little different than on a Friday night when you're out with your friends and having a good time. Context also gives different meanings. So when you see this symbol over here, what do you think of? We all probably think of the same thing, and that's Nazism, right? And that very dark and negative time period in history. But what has it historically represented? If we look back, context gives different meaning. So it was used 5,000 years before Hitler created the Nazi flag. And it stood for good fortune and luck and well-being. Very different than what, in modern time we think of when we see the swastika. So make sure you've answered all of the questions. Go back, rewind if you need to, and fill in any blanks that you have. And everybody have a great day.